set on, eh? I guess that helps, doesn't it, hey? What do you think? I think it probably does. Maybe. Maybe once in a while. No, it says I'm waiting for me. Am I actually going, or am I just, Okay. It looks like it's going. Okay. So, today I'm going to be working on this one again. There we go. You should be able to see that. Hey, Dave. Hey, Angie. Hey, Faye. How you guys doing? So, let's see here. Oops, wrong button. Let's see. Move this like that. And we'll find the chat so I can see it. Here like this. And there we go. Yay! So you guys can hear me all right? I'm assuming you can hear me all right. I know you're not going to be able to see everything great today, but you'll be able to see the overview. Because it's just, I gotta try and keep my head inside. So, hey Linda. So today we're doing this. It's, for any of you who haven't seen it before, it's Life Through a Mother's Eyes. It's a cross-stitch pattern, and it's mom looking at her daughter in the mirror while they're getting dressed for the daughter's wedding day. And I bought this years ago when I was going to get married. And I never did, so I never finished it. And so, I'm gonna start working on it. Because eventually I'll get married, I think. Maybe. We'll see. Right, honey? Is honey here yet? Probably not. Maybe now. So yeah, so this is what we're working on. Yay! Yeah, everybody has those days. So I've got, this is all the pattern going on here and stuff. And then I have I'm going to scribble it all up a copy. And I need a scribbler, I guess. Yeah, he might be in hiding. He's actually, I believe he's gone to feed the birds. Quack, quack, quack. Not quite quack, quack, quack. But he's feeding the birds. Let's see. Yeah, this too shall pass. There we go. That pen pins. And I'd rather have a marker. There, that markers too. But I have to reference the original picture on this one because I'd messed up the face. So I messed up the hair. Whoops, I messed up the hair. So I have to reference it on the original picture. Because I messed up the face. I had to undo it all. Oh, thank you. Yeah, it's cross stitch. It's an old pattern. It's called Through a Mother's Eyes. Now, I found out after that there's one Through a Father's Eyes as well. Where is it? Maybe I found it. There's one through, I believe, through a father's eyes. It was the same kind of thing, except with Dad. And I kind of said that I couldn't buy that one. This is Paula Vaughan. And I don't know, I bought it a while ago. I don't know if you can even get it anymore. I got it for $8.99. That tells you it's a while ago. Yeah, it's a beautiful pattern. I just love the darn thing. And, of course, I'm doing up for my mom. I planned 2 years ago give it to my mom on our wedding day when I got married to another person. It's apparently was originally $4.50, and I bought it for probably $9. Yeah, I don't think there's one that I can't do either. I pretty much do everything. I work on, everything. It's a pretty open market for me for what to do. As long as it's something I can do, as long as it's something I can try, I'll try and we'll see. You know what I'm saying. As long as it's something that I have access for materials to, I can pretty much do it. Blather, blather, blather. Okay, let's get the books going. So you guys can see me in my hair. I'm going to try really hard to keep my head out of the shot. But it's really hard with this stuff, so once in a while you just might see a top of the head. Mute. And...
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read for you by Chiquito Crasto. An account of some disturbances in Aungier Street. It is not worth telling, this story of mine, at least not worth writing. Told, indeed, as I have sometimes been called upon to tell it, to a circle of intelligent and eager faces, lighted up by a good after-dinner fire on a winter's evening, with a cold wind rising and wailing outside, and all snug and cosy within, it has gone off, though I say it, who should not, indifferent well. But it is a venture to do as you would have me. Pen, ink, and paper are cold vehicles for the marvellous, and a reader decidedly a more critical animal than a listener. If, however, you can induce your friends to read it after nightfall, and when the fireside talk has run for a while on thrilling tales of shapeless terror, in short, if you will secure me the molia tempora fundi, I will go to my work and say my say with better heart. Well then, these conditions presupposed, I shall waste no more words, but tell you simply how it all happened. My cousin, Tom Ludlow, and I studied medicine together. I think he would have succeeded had he stuck to the profession, but he preferred the church, poor fellow, and died early, a sacrifice to contagion, contracted in the noble discharge of his duties. For my present purpose, I say enough of his character when I mention that he was of a sedate but frank and cheerful nature, very exact in his observance of truth, and not by any means, like myself, of an excitable or nervous temperament. My uncle Ludlow, Tom's father, while we were attending lectures, purchased 3 or 4 old houses in Aungier Street, one of which was unoccupied. He resided in the country, and Tom proposed that we should take up our abode in the untenanted house, so long as it should continue unlet, a move which would accomplish the double end of settling us nearer alike to our lecture rooms and to our amusements, and of relieving us from the weekly charge of rent for our lodgings. Our furniture was very scant, our whole equipage remarkably modest and primitive, and, in short, our arrangements pretty nearly as simple as those of a bivouac. Our new plan was therefore executed almost as soon as conceived. The front drawing-room was our sitting-room, I had the bedroom over it, and Tom the back bedroom on the same floor, which nothing could have induced me to occupy. The house, to begin with, was a very old one. It had been, I believe, newly fronted about 50 years before. But this exception, it had nothing modern about it. The agent who bought it and looked into the titles for my uncle told me that it was sold, along with much other forfeited property, at Chichester House, I think in 1702, and had belonged to Sir Thomas Hackett, who was Lord Mayor of Dublin in James II's time. How old it was then, I can't say, but at all events it had seen years and changes enough to have contracted all that mysterious and saddened air, at once exciting and depressing, which belongs to most old mansions. There had been very little done in the way of modernizing details, and perhaps it was better so, for there was something queer and bygone in the very walls and ceilings, in the shape of doors and windows, in the odd diagonal site of the chimney-pieces, in the beams and ponderous cornices, not to mention the singular solidity of all the woodwork, from the banisters to the window-frames, which hopelessly defied disguise, and would have emphatically proclaimed their antiquity through any conceivable amount of modern finery and varnish. An effort had indeed been made to the extent of papering the drawing-rooms, but somehow the paper looked raw and out of keeping, and the old woman, who kept a little dirt-pie of a shop in the lane, and whose daughter, a girl of 52, was our solitary handmaid, coming in at sunrise and chastely receding again as soon as she had made all ready for tea in our state apartment. This woman, I say, remembered it when old Judge Horrocks, who, having earned the reputation of a particularly hanging judge, ended by hanging himself, as the coroner's jury found, under an impulse of temporary insanity, with a child skipping rope over the massive old banisters, resided there, entertaining good company with fine venison and rare old port. In those halcyon days the drawing-rooms were hung with gilded leather, and, I dare say, cut a good figure, for they were really spacious rooms. The bedrooms were wainscoted, but the front room was not gloomy, and in it the cosiness of antiquity quite overcome its sombre associations. But the back bedroom, with its two queerly placed melancholy windows, staring vacantly at the foot of the bed, and with the shadowy recess to be found in most old houses in Dublin, like a large ghostly closet, which, from congeniality of temperament, had amalgamated with the bedchamber and dissolved the partition. At night-time this alcove, as our maid was wont to call it, had in my eyes a specially sinister and suggestive character. Tom's distant and solitary candle glimmered vainly into its darkness. There it was, always overlooking him, always itself impenetrable. But this was only part of the effect. The whole room was, I can't tell how, repulsive to me. There was, I suppose, in its proportions and features, a latent discord, a certain mysterious and indescribable relation which jarred indistinctly upon some secret sense of the fitting and the safe, and raised indefinable suspicions and apprehensions of the imagination. On the whole, as I began by saying, nothing could have induced me to pass a night alone in it. I had never pretended to conceal from poor Tom my superstitious weakness, and he, on the other hand, most unaffectedly ridiculed my tremors. The sceptic was, however, destined to receive a lesson, as you shall hear. We had not been very long in occupation of our respective dormitories when I began to complain of uneasy nights and disturbed sleep. I was, I suppose, the more impatient under this annoyance, as I was usually a sound sleeper, and by no means prone to nightmares. It was now, however, my destiny, instead of enjoying my customary repose, every night to sup full of horrors. After a preliminary course of disagreeable and frightful dreams, my troubles took a definite form, and the same vision, without an appreciable variation in a single detail, visited me at least on an average every second night in the week. Now this dream, nightmare or infernal illusion, which you please, of which I was the miserable sport, was on this wise. I saw, or thought I saw, with the most abominable distinctness, although at the time in profound darkness, every article of furniture and accidental arrangement of the chamber in which I lay. This, as you know, is incidental to ordinary nightmare. Well, while in this clairvoyant condition, which seemed by the lighting up of the theatre in which was to be exhibited the monotonous tableau of horror which made my nights insupportable, my attention invariably became, I know not why, fixed upon the windows opposite the foot of my bed, and uniformly with the same effect a sense of dreadful anticipation always took slow but sure possession of me. I became somehow conscious of a sort of horrid but undefined preparation going forward in some unknown quarter, and by some unknown agency, for my torment. And after an interval which always seemed to me of the same length, a picture suddenly flew up to the window, where it remained fixed, as if by an electrical attraction, and my discipline of horror then commenced, to last perhaps for hours. The picture thus mysteriously glued to the window panes was the portrait of an old man, in a crimson-flowered silk dressing-gown, the folds of which I could now describe with a countenance embodying a strange mixture of intellect, sensuality, and power, but withal sinister and full of malignant omen. His nose was hooked, like the beak of a vulture, his eyes large, grey, and prominent, and lighted up with a more than mortal cruelty and coldness. These features were surmounted by a crimson velvet cap, the hair that peeped from under which was white with age, while the eyebrows retained their original blackness. Well, I remember every line, hue, and shadow of that stony countenance, and well I may. The gaze of this hellish visage was fixed upon me, and mine returned it with the inexplicable fascination of nightmare, for what appeared to me to be hours of agony. At last the cock he crew, away then flew. The fiend who had enslaved me through the awful watches of the night, and harassed and nervous, I rose to the duties of the day. I can't say exactly why, but it may have been from the exquisite anguish and profound impressions of unearthly horror with which the strange phantasmagoria was associated, an insurmountable antipathy to describing the exact nature of my nightly troubles to my friend and comrade. Generally, however, I told him that I was haunted by abominable dreams, and true to the imputed materialism of medicine, we put our heads together to dispel my horrors, not by exorcism, but by a tonic. I will do this tonic justice, and frankly admit that the accursed portrait began to intermit its visits under its influence. What of that? Was this singular apparition as full of character as of terror, therefore the creature of my fancy, or the invention of my poor stomach? Was it, in short, subjective, to borrow the technical slang of the day, and not the palpable aggression and intrusion of an external agent? That, good friend, as we will both admit, by no means follows. The evil spirit who enthralled my senses in the shape of that portrait may have been just as near me, just as energetic, just as malignant, though I saw him not. What means the whole moral code of revealed religion regarding the due keeping of our bodies, soberness, temperance, etc.? Here is an obvious connection between the material and the invisible. The healthy tone of the system, and its unimpaired energy, may, for aught we can tell, guard us against influences which would otherwise render life itself terrific. The mesmerist and the electrobiologist will fail upon an average with 9 patients out of 10. So may the evil spirit. Special conditions of the corporeal system are indispensable to the production of certain spiritual phenomena. The operation succeeds sometimes, sometimes fails, that is all. I found afterwards that my would-be sceptical companion had his troubles too. But of these I knew nothing yet. One night, for a wonder, I was sleeping soundly, when I was roused by a step on the lobby outside my room, followed by the loud clang of what turned out to be a large brass candlestick, flung with all his force by poor Tom Ludlow over the banisters, and rattling with a rebound down the second flight of stairs, and almost concurrently with this, Tom burst open my door and bounced into my room backwards in a state of extraordinary agitation. I had jumped out of bed and clutched him by the arm before I had any distinct idea of my own whereabouts. There we were, in our shirts, standing before the open door, staring through the great old banister opposite at the lobby window, through which the sickly light of a clouded moon was gleaming. "What's the matter, Tom? What's the matter with you? What the devil's the matter with you, Tom?" I demanded, shaking him with nervous impatience. He took a long breath before he answered me, and then it was not very coherently. "It's nothing, at all. Did I speak? What did I say? Where's the candle, Richard? It's dark. I had a candle." "Yes, dark enough," I said. "But what's the matter? What is it? Why don't you speak, Tom? Have you lost your wits? What is the matter?" "The matter? Oh, it is all over. It must have been a dream, nothing at all but a dream. Don't you think so? It could not be anything more than a dream." "Of course," said I, feeling uncommonly nervous, "it was a dream." "I thought," he said, "there was a man in my room, and I jumped out of bed, and where's the candle?" "In your room, most likely," I said. "Shall I go and bring it?" "No, stay here. Don't go. It's no matter. Don't, I tell you. It was all a dream. Bolt the door, Dick. I'll stay here with you. I feel nervous. So, Dick, like a good fellow, light your candle and open the window. I'm in a shocking state." I did as he asked me, and robing himself like Grenouille in one of my blankets, he seated himself close beside my bed. Everyone knows how contagious is fear of all sorts, but more especially that particular kind of fear under which poor Tom was at that moment labouring. I would not have heard, nor I believe would he have recapitulated, just at that moment, for half the world, the details of the hideous vision which had so unmanned him. "Don't mind telling me anything about your nonsensical dream, Tom," said I, affecting contempt, really in a panic. "Let us talk about something else. But it is quite plain that this dirty old house disagrees with us both, and hang me if I stay here longer to be pestered with indigestion and bad nights, so we may as well look out for lodgings, don't you think so, at once?" Tom agreed, and after an interval said, "I have been thinking, Richard, that it is a long time since I saw my father, and I have made up my mind to go down to-morrow and return in a day or two, and you can take rooms for us in the meantime." I fancied that this resolution, obviously the result of the vision which had so profoundly scared him, would probably vanish next morning with the damps and shadows of night. But I was mistaken. Off went Tom at peep of day to the country, having agreed that so soon as I had secured suitable lodgings I was to recall him by letter from his visit to my Uncle Ludlow. Now, anxious as I was to change my quarters, it so happened, owing to a series of petty procrastinations and accidents, that nearly a week elapsed before my bargain was made, and my letter of recall on the wing to Tom, and in the meantime a trifling adventure or two had occurred to your humble servant, which, absurd as they now appear, diminished by distance, did certainly at the time serve to whet my appetite for change considerably. A night or two after the departure of my comrade, I was sitting by my bedroom fire, the door locked, and the ingredients of a tumbler of hot whisky punch upon the crazy spider table, for, as the best mode of keeping the black spirits white and blue spirits in grey, with which I was environed, at bay, I had adopted the practice recommended by the wisdom of my ancestors, and kept my spirits up by pouring spirits down. I had thrown aside my volume of anatomy, and was treating myself by way of a tonic, preparatory to my punch and bed, to a half-dozen pages of the Spectator, when I heard a step on the flight of stairs descending from the attics. It was 2 o'clock, and the streets were as silent as a churchyard. The sounds were therefore perfectly distinct. There was a slow heavy tread, characterized by the emphasis and deliberation of age, descending by the narrow staircase from above. And what made the sound most singular, it was plain that the feet which produced it were perfectly bare, measuring the descent with something between a pound and a flop, very ugly to hear. I knew well that my attendant had gone away many hours before, and that nobody but myself had any business in the house. It was quite plain also that the person who was coming downstairs had no intention whatever of concealing his movements, but, on the contrary, appeared disposed to make even more noise, and proceed even more deliberately, than was at all necessary. When the step reached the foot of the stairs outside my room, it seemed to stop, and I expected every moment to see my door open spontaneously, and give admission to the original of my detested portrait. I was, however, relieved in a few seconds by hearing the descent renewed, just in the same manner, upon the staircase leading down to the drawing-rooms, and thence, after another pause, down the next flight, and so on to the hall, whence I heard no more. Now, by the time the sound had ceased, I was wound up, as they say, to a very unpleasant pitch of excitement. I listened, but there was not a stir. I screwed up my courage to a decisive experiment, opened my door, and in a stentorian voice boiled over the banisters. "Who's there?" There was no answer, but the ringing of my own voice through the empty old house, no renewal of movement, nothing, in short, to give my unpleasant sensations a definite direction. There is, I think, something most disagreeably disenchanting in the sound of one's own voice under such circumstances, exerted in solitude and in vain. It redoubled my sense of isolation, and my misgivings increased on perceiving that the door, which I certainly thought I had left open, was closed behind me. In a vague alarm lest my retreat should be cut off, I got again into my room as quickly as I could, where I remained in a state of imaginary blockade, and very uncomfortable indeed, till morning. Next night brought no return of my barefooted fellow-lodger, but the night following, being in my bed and in the dark, somewhere, I suppose, about the same hour as before, I distinctly heard the old fellow again descending from the garrets. This time I had had my punch, and the morale of the garrison was consequently excellent. Jumped out of bed, clutched the poker as I passed the expiring fire, and in a moment was upon the lobby. The sound had ceased by this time. The dark and chill were discouraging, and guess my horror when I saw, or thought I saw, a black monster, whether in the shape of a man or a bear I could not say, standing with its back to the wall, on the lobby, facing me, with a pair of great greenish eyes shining dimly out. Now I must be frank and confess that the cupboard which displayed our plates and cups stood just there, though at the moment I did not recollect it. At the same time I must honestly say that, making every allowance for an excited imagination, I never could satisfy myself that I was made the dupe of my own fancy in this matter. For this apparition, after one or two shiftings of shape, as if in the act of incipient transformation, began, as it seemed on second thoughts, to advance upon me in its original form. From an instinct of terror rather than of courage, I hurled the poker with all my force at its head, and to the music of a horrid crash made my way into my room and double-locked the door. Then in a minute more I heard the horrid bare feet walk down the stairs, till the sound ceased in the hall as on the former occasion. If the apparition of the night before was an ocular delusion of my fancy, sporting with the dark outlines of our cupboard, and if its horrid eyes were nothing but a pair of inverted teacups, I had at all events the satisfaction of having launched the poker with admirable effect, and in true fancy phrase knocked its two daylights into one, as the commingled fragments of my tea service testified. I did my best to gather comfort and courage from these evidences, but it would not do. And then what could I say of those horrid bare feet, and the regular tramp, tramp, tramp which measured the distance of the entire staircase through the solitude of my haunted dwelling, and an hour when no good influence was stirring? Confound it! The whole affair was abominable. I was out of spirits and dreaded the approach of night. It came, ushered ominously in with a thunderstorm and dull torrents of depressing rain. Earlier than usual the streets grew silent, and by 12 o'clock nothing but the comfortless pattering of the rain was to be heard. I made myself as snug as I could. I lighted 2 candles instead of 1. I forswore bed, and held myself in readiness for a sally, candle in hand, for coûte qui coûte I was resolved to see the being, if visible at all, who troubled the nightly stillness of my mansion. I was fidgety and nervous, and tried in vain to interest myself with my books. I walked up and down my room, whistling in turn martial and hilarious music, and listening ever and anon for the dreaded noise. I sat down and stared at the square label on the solemn and reserved-looking black bottle until Flanagan and Company's best old malt whisky grew into a sort of subdued accompaniment to all the fantastic and horrible speculations which chased one another through my brain. Silence, meanwhile, grew more silent, and darkness darker. I listened in vain for the rumble of a vehicle or the dull clamour of a distant drow. There was nothing but the sound of a rising wind, which had succeeded the thunderstorm that had travelled over the Dublin mountains quite out of hearing. In the middle of this great city I began to feel myself alone with nature, and heaven knows what beside. My courage was ebbing. Punch, however, which makes beasts of so many, made a man of me again, just in time to hear with tolerable nerve and firmness the lumpy, flabby, naked feet deliberately descending the stairs again. I took a candle, not without a tremor. As I crossed the floor, I tried to extemporize a prayer, but stopped short to listen, and never finished it. The steps continued. I confess I hesitated for some seconds at the door before I took heart of grace and opened it. When I peeped out, the lobby was perfectly empty. There was no monster standing on the staircase, and as the detested sound ceased, I was reassured enough to venture forward nearly to the banisters. Horror of horrors! Within a stair or two beneath the spot where I stood, the unearthly treads smote the floor. My eye caught something in motion. It was about the size of Goliath's foot. It was grey, heavy, and flapped with a dead weight from one step to another. As I am alive, it was the most monstrous grey rat I ever beheld or imagined. Shakespeare says, "Some men here cannot abide a gaping pig, and some that are mad if they behold a cat." I went well nigh out of my wits when I beheld this rat. For, laugh at me as you may, it fixed upon me, I thought, a perfectly human expression of malice. And, as it shuffled about and looked up into my face almost from beneath my feet, I saw I could swear it. I felt it then, and know it now, the infernal gaze in the accursed countenance of my old friend in the portrait, transfused into the visage of the bloated vermin before me. I bounced into my room again with a feeling of loathing and horror I cannot describe, and locked and bolted my door as if a lion had been at the other side. Damn him or it! Curse the portrait and its original! I felt in my soul that the rat, yes, the rat I had just seen, was that evil being in masquerade, and rambling through the house upon some infernal night lark. Next morning I was early, trudging through the miry streets, and among other transactions posted a peremptory note recalling Tom. On my return, however, I found a note from my absent chum announcing his intended return next day. I was doubly rejoiced at this, because I had succeeded in getting rooms, and because the change of scene and return of my comrade were rendered specially pleasant by the last night's half-ridiculous, half-horrible adventure. I slept extemporaneously in my new quarters in Aungier Street that night, and next morning returned for breakfast to the haunted mansion, where I was certain Tom would call immediately on his arrival. I was quite right. Came, and almost his first question referred to the primary object of our change of residence. "Thank God," he said with genuine fervour, on hearing that all was arranged. "On your account I am delighted. As to myself, I assure you that no earthly consideration could have induced me ever again to pass a night in this disastrous old house." "Confound the house!" I ejaculated, with a genuine mixture of fear and detestation. "We have not had a pleasant hour since we came to live here." And so I went on, and related incidentally my adventure with the plethoric old rat. "Well, if that were all," said my cousin, affecting to make light of the matter, "I don't think I should have minded it very much." "Ay, but it's I. Its countenance, my dear Tom," urged I. "If you had seen that, you would have felt it might be anything but what it seemed." "I incline to think the best conjurer in such a case would be an able-bodied cat," he said, with a provoking chuckle. "But let us hear of your own adventure," I said tartly. At this challenge he looked uneasily round him. I had poked up a very unpleasant recollection. "You shall hear it, Dick. I'll tell it to you," he said. "Begad, sir, I should feel quite queer, though, telling it here, though we are too strong a body for ghosts to meddle with just now." Though he spoke this like a joke, I think it was serious calculation. Our Hebe was in a corner of the room, packing our cracked Delft tea and dinner services in a basket. She soon suspended operations, and with mouth and eyes wide open became an absorbed listener. Tom's experiences were told nearly in these words. "I saw it 3 times, Dick. 3 distinct times, and I am perfectly certain it meant me some infernal harm. I was, I say, in danger, in extreme danger, for if nothing else had happened, my reason would most certainly have failed me, unless I had escaped so soon. Thank God, I did escape. The first night of this hateful disturbance, I was lying in the attitude of sleep in that lumbering old bed. I hate to think of it. I was really wide awake, though I had put out my candle and was lying as quietly as I had been asleep, and although accidentally restless, my thoughts were running in a cheerful and agreeable channel. I think it must have been 2 o'clock at least when I thought I heard a sound in that odious dark recess at the far end of the bedroom. It was as if someone was drawing a piece of cord slowly along the floor, lifting it up, and dropping it softly down again in coils. I sat up once or twice in my bed, but could see nothing, so I concluded it must be mice in the wainscot. I felt no emotion graver than curiosity, and after a few minutes ceased to observe it. While lying in this state, strange to say, without at first a suspicion of anything supernatural, on a sudden I saw an old man, rather stout and square, in a sort of roan red dressing-gown, and with a black cap on his head, moving stiffly and slowly in a diagonal direction, from the recess across the floor of the bedroom, passing my bed at the foot, and entering the lumber closet at the left.
He had something under his arm, his head hung a little to one side, and, merciful God, when I saw his face—"
Tom stopped for a while and then said,
"That awful countenance, which, living or dying, I never can forget, disclosed what he was. Without turning to the right or left, he passed beside me and entered the closet by the bed's head. While this fearful and indescribable type of death and guilt was passing, I felt that I had no more power to speak or stir than if I had been myself a corpse. For hours after it had disappeared, I was too terrified and weak to move. As soon as daylight came, I took courage and examined the room, and especially the course which the frightful intruder had seemed to take. But there was not a vestige to indicate anybody's having passed there. No signs of any disturbing agency visible among the lumber that strewed the floor of the closet. I now began to recover a little. I was fagged and exhausted, and at last overpowered by a feverish sleep. I came down late, and finding you out of spirits on account of your dreams about the portrait whose original I am now certain disclosed himself to me, I did not care to talk about the infernal vision. In fact, I was trying to persuade myself that the whole thing was an illusion, and I did not like to revive in their intensity the hated impressions of the past night, or to risk the constancy of my scepticism by recounting the tale of my sufferings. It required some nerve, I can tell you, to go to my haunted chamber next night and lie down quietly in the same bed," continued Tom. "I did so with a degree of trepidation, which, I am not ashamed to say, a very little matter would have sufficed to stimulate to downright panic. This night, however, passed off quietly enough, as also the next, and so too did 2 or 3 more. I grew more confident, and began to fancy that I believed in the theories of spectral illusions with which I had first vainly tried to impose upon my convictions. The apparition had been indeed altogether anomalous. It had crossed the room without any recognition of my presence. I had not disturbed it, and it had no mission to me. What then was the imaginable use of its crossing the room in a visible shape at all? Of course, if it had been in the closet instead of going there, as easily as it introduced itself into the recess without entering the chamber in a shape discernible by the senses. Besides, how the deuce had I seen it? It was a dark night. I had no candle, there was no fire, and yet I saw it as distinctly in colouring and outline as ever I beheld a human form. A cataleptic dream would explain it all, and I was determined that a dream it should be. One of the most remarkable phenomena connected with the practice of mendacity is the vast number of deliberate lies we tell ourselves, whom, of all persons, we can least expect to deceive. In all this, I need hardly tell you, Dick, I was simply lying to myself and did not believe one word of the wretched humbug. Yet I went on, as men will do, like persevering charlatans and impostors, who tire people into credulity by the mere force of reiteration. So I hoped to win myself over at last to a comfortable scepticism about the ghost. Had he not appeared a second time, that certainly was a comfort. And what, after all, did I care for him and his queer old tuggery and strange looks? Not a fig. I was nothing the worse for having seen him, and a good story the better. So I tumbled into bed, put out my candle, and, cheered by a loud drunken quarrel in the back lane, went fast asleep. From this slumber I awoke with a start. I knew I had had a horrible dream, but what it was I could not remember. My heart was thumping furiously. I felt bewildered and feverish. I sat up in the bed and looked about the room. A broad flood of moonlight came in through the curtainless window. Everything was as I had last seen it, and though the domestic squabble in the back lane was, unhappily for me, allayed, I yet could hear a pleasant fellow singing on his way home the then popular comic ditty called Murphy Delaney. Taking advantage of this diversion, I lay down again, with my face towards the fireplace, and, closing my eyes, did my best to think of nothing else but the song, which was every moment growing fainter in the distance. 'Twas Murphy Delaney, so funny and frisky, stepped into a shaving shop to get a skinful. He reeled out again pretty well lined with whisky, as fresh as a shamrock, as blind as a bull. The singer, whose condition I dare say resembled that of his hero, was soon too far off to regale my ears any more, and as his music died away, I myself sank into a doze, neither sound nor refreshing. Somehow the song had got into my head, and I went meandering on through the adventures of my respectable fellow countryman, who, on emerging from the shebeen shop, fell into a river, from which he was fished up to be set upon by a coroner's jury who, having learned from a horse doctor that he was dead as a doornail, so there was no end, returned their verdict accordingly just as he returned to his senses, when an angry altercation and a pitched battle between the body and the coroner winds up the lay with due spirit and pleasantry. Through this ballad I continued with a weary monotony to plod down to the very last line, and then da capo, and so on in my uncomfortable half-sleep for how long I can't conjecture. I found myself at last, however, muttering, "Dead as a doornail," so there was an end, and something like another voice within me seemed to say, very faintly but sharply, "Dead, dead, dead, and may the Lord have mercy on your soul." And instantaneously I was wide awake and staring right before me from the pillow. Now, will you believe it, Dick? I saw the same accursed figure standing full front and gazing at me with its stony and fiendish countenance, not 2 yards from the bedside.
Tom stopped here and wiped the perspiration from his face. I felt very queer. The girl was as pale as Tom, and assembled as we were in the very scene of these adventures, we were all, I dare say, equally grateful for the clear daylight and the resuming bustle out of doors.
For about 3 seconds only I saw it plainly. Then it grew indistinct. But for a long time there was something like a column of dark vapour where it had been standing, between me and the wall, and I felt sure that he was still there. After a good while this appearance went too. I took my clothes downstairs to the hall, and dressed there with the door half open, then went out into the street and walked about the town till morning, when I came back in a miserable state of nervousness and exhaustion. I was such a fool, Dick, as to be ashamed to tell you how I came to be so upset. I thought you would laugh at me, especially as I'd always talked philosophy and treated your ghosts with contempt. I concluded you would give me no quarter, so kept the tale of horror to myself. Now, Dick, you will hardly believe me when I assure you that for many nights after this last experience I did not go to my room at all. I used to sit up for a while in the drawing-room after you had gone to your bed, and then steal down softly to the hall door, let myself out, and sit in the Robin Hood Tavern until the last guest went off, and then I got through the night like a sentry, pacing the streets till morning. For more than a week I never slept in bed. I sometimes had a snooze on a form in the Robin Hood, and sometimes a nap in a chair during the day, but regular sleep I had absolutely none. I was quite resolved that we should get into another house, but I could not bring myself to tell you the reason. I somehow put it off from day to day, although my life was, during every hour of this procrastination, rendered as miserable as that of a felon with the constables on his track. I was growing absolutely ill from this wretched mode of life. One afternoon I determined to enjoy an hour's sleep upon your bed. I hated mine, so that I had never, except in a stealthy visit every day to unmake it, lest Martha should discover the secret of my nightly absence, enter the ill-omened chamber. As ill luck would have it, you had locked your bedroom and taken away the key. I went into my own to unsettle the bedclothes, as usual, and give the bed the appearance of having been slept in. Now, a variety of circumstances occurred to bring about the dreadful scene through which I was that night to pass. In the first place, I was literally overpowered with fatigue and longing for sleep. In the next place, the effect of this extreme exhaustion upon my nerves resembled that of a narcotic, and rendered me less susceptible than perhaps I should in any other condition have been of the exciting fears which had become habitual to me. Then again, a little bit of the window was open, a pleasant freshness pervaded the room, and to crown all, the cheerful sun of day was making the room quite pleasant. What was to prevent my enjoying an hour's nap here? The whole air was resonant with the cheerful hum of life, and the broad matter-of-fact light of day filled every corner of the room. I yielded, stifling my qualms, to the almost overpowering temptation, and merely throwing off my coat and loosening my cravat, I lay down, limiting myself to half an hour's doze, in the unwonted enjoyment of a feather bed, a coverlet, and a bolster. It was horribly insidious, and the demon no doubt marked my infatuated preparations. Dolt that I was, I fancied, with mind and body worn out for want of sleep, and an arrear of a full week's rest to my credit, that such measures as half an hour's sleep in such a situation was possible. My sleep was death-like, long and dreamless. Without start or fearful sensation of any kind, I waked gently, but completely. It was, as you have good reason to remember, long past midnight, I believe about 2 o'clock. When sleep had been deep and long enough to satisfy nature thoroughly, one often wakens in this way, suddenly, tranquilly, and completely. There was a figure seated in that lumbering old sofa-chair near the fireplace. Its back was rather towards me, but I could not be mistaken. It turned slowly round, and, merciful heavens, there was the stony face, with its infernal lineaments of malignity and despair, gloating on me. There was now no doubt as to its consciousness of my presence, and the hellish malice with which it was animated, for it arose, and drew close to the bedside. There was a rope about its neck, and the other end, coiled up, it held stiffly in its hand. My good angel nerved me for this horrible crisis. I remained for some seconds transfixed by the gaze of this tremendous phantom. He came close to the bed, and appeared on the point of mounting upon it. The next instant I was upon the floor at the far side, and in a moment was, I don't know how, upon the lobby. But the spell was not yet broken. The valley of the shadow of death was not yet traversed. The abhorred phantom stood before me there. It was standing near the banisters, stooping a little, and with one end of the rope round its neck was poising a noose at the other, as if to throw it over mine. And while engaged in this baleful pantomime, it wore a smile so sensual, so unspeakably dreadful, that my senses were nearly overpowered. I saw and remember nothing more until I found myself in your room. I had a wonderful escape, Dick. There is no disputing that. An escape for which, while I live, I shall bless the mercy of heaven. No one can conceive or imagine what it is for flesh and blood to stand in the presence of such a thing. But one who has had the terrific experience, Dick, a shadow has passed over me. A chill has crossed my blood and marrow, and I will never be the same again. Never, Dick, never. Our handmaid, a mature girl of 52, as I have said, stayed her hand, as Tom's story proceeded, and by little and little drew near to us, with open mouth, and her brows contracted over her little beady black eyes, till, stealing a glance over her shoulder now and then, she established herself close behind us. During the relation she had made various earnest comments in an undertone, but these and her ejaculations, for the sake of brevity and simplicity, I have omitted in my narration. "It's often I heard tell of it," she now said, "but I never believed it rightly till now, though indeed, why should not I? Does not my mother down here in the lane know queer stories, God bless us, beyond telling about it? But you ought not to have slept in the back room. She was loath to let me be going in and out of that room even in the daytime, let alone for any Christian to spend the night in it. For sure she says it was his own bedroom." "Whose own bedroom?" we asked in a breath. "Why, his, the old judge's. Judge Horrocks, to be sure, God rest his soul." And she looked fearfully round. "Amen," I muttered. "But did he die there?" "Die there? No, not quite there," she said. "Sure, was it not over the banisters he hung himself, the old sinner, God be merciful to us all? And was not it in the alcove they found the handles of the skipping rope cut off, and the knife where he was settling the cord, God bless us, to hang himself with? It was his housekeeper's daughter owned the rope, my mother often told me, and the child never throve after, and used to be starting up out of his sleep and screeching in the night time, with dreams and frights that come on her. And they said how it was the spirit of the old judge that was tormenting her, and she used to be roaring and yelling out to hold back the big old fellow with the crooked neck, and then she'd screech, 'Oh, the master, he's stamping at me and beckoning to me, mother darling, don't let me go.' And so the poor creature died at last, and the doctors said it was rather on the brain, for it was all they could say." "How long ago was all this?" I asked. "Oh, then, how would I know?" she answered. "But it must be a wonderful long time ago, for the housekeeper was an old woman with a pipe in her mouth, and not a tooth left, and better not 80 years old when my mother was first married. And they said she was a real buxom fine-dressed woman when the old judge come to his end. And indeed, my mother's not far from 80 years old herself this day, and what made it worse for the unnatural old villain, God rest his soul, to frighten the little girl out of the world the way he did, was what was mostly thought and believed by every one. My mother says how the poor little creature was his own child, for he was by all accounts an old villain every way, and the hangingest judge that ever was known in Ireland's ground." "From what you said about the danger of sleeping in that room," said I suppose there were stories about the ghost having appeared there to others." "Well, there was things, and queer things, surely," she answered, as it seemed with some reluctance. "And why would not there? Sure was it not up in that same room he slept for more than 20 years? And was it not in the alcove he got the rope ready that done his own business at last, the way he'd done many a better man in his lifetime? And was not the body lying in the same bed after death, and put in the coffin there too, and carried out to his grave from it in Peter's churchyard after the coroner was done? But there were queer stories, my mother has them all, about how one Nicholas Spade got into trouble on the head of it." "And what did they say of this Nicholas Spade?" I asked. "Oh, for that matter, it's soon told," she answered. And she certainly did relate a very strange story, which so piqued my curiosity that I took occasion to visit the ancient lady, her mother, from whom I learned many very curious particulars. Indeed, I was tempted to tell the tale, but my fingers are weary, and I must defer it. But if you wish to hear it another time, I shall do my best. When we had heard the strange tale I have not told you, we put one or two further questions to her about the alleged spectral visitations to which the house had, ever since the death of the wicked old judge, been subjected. "No one ever had luck in it," she told us. "There was always cross accidents, sudden deaths, and short times in it. The first took it was a family, I forget their name, but at any rate there were 2 young ladies and their papa. He was about 60, and a stout, healthy gentleman as you'd wish to see at that age. Well, he slept in that unlucky back bedroom, and God between us and harm, sure enough he was found dead one morning half out of his bed, with his head as black as a shoe, and swelled like a pudding hanging down near the floor. It was a fit, they said. He was as dead as a mackerel, and so he could not say what it was. But the old people were all sure that it was nothing at all but the old judge. God bless us, that frightened him out of his senses and his life together. Some time after, there was a rich old maiden lady took the house. I don't know which room she slept in, but she lived alone, and at any rate one morning the servants going down early to their work found her sitting on the passage stairs shivering and talking to herself quite mad, and never a word more could any of them of her friends get from her ever afterwards but, 'Don't ask me to go, for I promised to wait for him.' They never made out from her who it was she meant by him, but of course those that knew all about the old house were at no loss for the meaning of all that happened to her. Then afterwards, when the house was let out in lodgings, there was Mickey Byrne that took the same room, with his wife and 3 children, and sure I heard Mrs. Byrne myself telling how the children used to be lifted up in the bed at night, she could not see by what means, and how they were starting and screeching every hour, just all as one as the housekeeper's little girl that died, till at last one night poor Mickey had a drop in him, the way he used now and again, and what do you think, in the middle of the night she thought he heard a noise on the stairs, and being in liquor, nothing less I'd do him, but out he must go himself to see what was wrong. Well, after that, all she ever heard of him was him saying, 'Oh God,' and a tumble that shook the very house, and there sure enough he was lying on the lower stairs under the lobby, with his neck smashed double under him, where he was flung over the banisters." Then the handmaiden added, "I'll go down to the lane and send up Joe Garvey to pack up the rest of the tea things, and bring all the things across to your new lodgings." And so we sallied out together, each of us breathing more freely, I have no doubt, as we crossed that ill-omened threshold for the last time. Now, I may add thus much, in compliance with the immemorial usage of the realm of fiction, which sees the hero not only through his adventures, but fairly out of the world. You must have perceived that what the flesh, blood, and bone hero of romance proper is to the regular compounder of fiction, this old house of brick, wood, and mortar is to the humble recorder of this true tale. I therefore relate, as is duty bound, the catastrophe which ultimately befell it, which was simply this: that about 2 years subsequently to my story, it was taken by a quack doctor who called himself Baron Doolsturf, and filled the parlour windows with bottles of indescribable horrors preserved in brandy, and the newspapers with the usual grandiloquent and mendacious advertisements. This gentleman, among his virtues, did not reckon sobriety, and one night, being overcome with much wine, he set fire to his curtains, partially burned himself, and totally consumed the house. It was afterwards rebuilt, and for a time an undertaker established himself in the premises. I have now told you my own and Tom's adventures, together with some valuable collateral particulars, and having acquitted myself of my engagement, I wish you a very good night and pleasant dreams. End of An Account of Some Strange Disturbances in Aungier Street, by Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu. Read for you by Chiquito Crasto, Birmingham, Alabama.
To the Dead in the Graveyard Under My Window, by Adelaide Crapsey. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Laura Armentrout. To the Dead in the Graveyard Under My Window, by Adelaide Crapsey. Written in a moment of exasperation. How can you lie so still? All day I watch, and never a blade of all the green sod moves to show where restlessly you toss and turn, and fling a desperate arm, or draw up knees stiffened and aching from their long disuse. I watch all night, and not one ghost comes forth to take its freedom of the midnight hour. Oh, have you no rebellion in your bones? The very worms must scorn you where you lie, a pallid, mouldering, acquiescent folk, meek inhabitants of unresented graves. Why are you there in your straight row on row, where I must ever see you from my bed, that in your mere dumb presence iterate the text so weary in my ears? Lie still and rest. Be patient and lie still and rest. I'll not be patient. I will not lie still. There is a brown road runs between the pines, and further on the purple woodlands lie, and still beyond blue mountains lift and loom. And I would walk the road, and I would be deep in the wooded shade, and I would reach the windy mountain tops that touch the clouds. My eyes may follow, but my feet are held. Recumbent as you others, must I too submit? Be mimic of your movelessness, with pillow and counterpane for stone and sod? And if the many sayings of the wise teach of submission, I will not submit. But with a spirit all unreconciled, flash an unquenched defiance to the stars. Better it is to walk, to run, to dance. Better it is to laugh and leap and sing, to know the open skies of dawn and night, to move untrammeled down the flaming noon. And I will clamber it through weary days, keeping the edge of deprivation sharp, nor with the pliant speaking on my lips of resignation, sister to defeat. I'll not be patient. I will not lie still. And in ironic quietude, who is the despot of our days and lord of dust needs but scarce heeding, wait to drop grim, casual comment on rebellion's end. Yes, yes, willful and petulant, but now as dead and quiet as the other are. And this each body and ghost of you hath heard, that in your graves do therefore lie so still. End of To the Dead in the Graveyard Under My Window.
Beyond the Wall by Ambrose Bierce. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read for you by Chiquito Crasto. Beyond the Wall. Many years ago, on my way from Hong Kong to New York, I passed a week in San Francisco. A long time had gone by since I had been in that city, during which my ventures in the Orient had prospered beyond my hope. I was rich and could afford to revisit my own country, to renew my friendship with such of the companions of my youth as still lived and remembered me with the old affection. Chief of these, I hoped, was Mohan Dampier, an old schoolmate with whom I had held a desultory correspondence which had long ceased, as is the way of correspondence between men. You may have observed that the indisposition to write a merely social letter is in the ratio of the square of the distance between you and your correspondent. It is a law. I remember Dampier as a handsome, strong young fellow of scholarly tastes, with an aversion to work and a marked indifference to many of the things that the world cares for, including wealth, of which, however, he had inherited enough to put him beyond the reach of want. In his family, one of the oldest and most aristocratic in the country, it was, I think, a matter of pride that no member of it had ever been in trade nor politics, nor suffered any kind of distinction. Mohan was a trifle sentimental, and had in him a singular element of superstition, which led him to the study of all manner of occult subjects, although his sane mental health safeguarded him against fantastic and perilous fates. He made daring incursions into the realm of the unreal without renouncing his residence in the partly surveyed and charted region of what we are pleased to call certitude. The night of my visit to him was stormy. The Californian winter was on, and the incessant rain splashed in the deserted streets, or, lifted by irregular gusts of wind, was hurled against the houses with incredible fury. With no small difficulty my cabman found the right place, away out toward the ocean beach in a sparsely populated suburb. The dwelling, a rather ugly one apparently, stood in the centre of its grounds, which, as nearly as I could make out in the gloom, were destitute of either flowers or grass. 3 or 4 trees, writhing and moaning in the torment of the tempest, appeared to be trying to escape from their dismal environment and take the chance of finding a better one out at sea. The house was a 2-story brick structure with a tower, a story higher, at one corner. In the window of that was the only visible light. Something in the appearance of the place made me shudder, a performance that may have been assisted by a rill of rain-water down my back as I scuttled to cover in the doorway. In answer to my note apprising him of my wish to call, Dampier had written, "Don't ring. Open the door and come up." I did so. The staircase was dimly lighted by a single gas jet at the top of the second flight. I managed to reach the landing without disaster, and entered by an open door into the lighted square room of the tower. Dampier came forward in gown and slippers to receive me, giving me the greeting that I wished, and if I had held a thought that it might more fitly have accorded me at the front door, the first look at him dispelled any sense of his inhospitality. He was not the same. Hardly past middle age, he had gone grey and had acquired a pronounced stoop. His figure was thin and angular, his face deeply lined, his complexion dead white, without a touch of colour. His eyes, unnaturally large, glowed with a fire that was almost uncanny. He seated me, proffered a cigar, and with grave and obvious sincerity assured me of the pleasure that it gave him to meet me. Some unimportant conversation followed, but all the while I was dominated by a melancholy sense of the great change in him. This he must have perceived, for he suddenly said with a bright enough smile, "You are disappointed in me. Non sum qualis eram." I hardly knew what to reply, but managed to say, "Why, really, I don't know. Your Latin is about the same." He brightened again. "Oh," he said, "being a dead language, it grows in appropriateness. But please have the patience to wait. Where I am going there is perhaps a better tongue. Will you care to have a message in it?" The smile faded as he spoke, and as he concluded he was looking into my eyes with a gravity that distressed me. Yet I would not surrender myself to his mood, nor permit me to see how deeply his prescience of death affected me. "I fancy that it will be long," I said, "before human speech will cease to serve our need, and then the need, with its possibilities of service, will have passed." He made no reply, and I too was silent, for the talk had taken a dispiriting turn. Yet I knew not how to give it a more agreeable character. Suddenly, in a pause of the storm, when the dead silence was almost startling by contrast with the previous uproar, I heard a gentle tapping, which appeared to come from the wall behind my chair. The sound was such as might have been made by a human hand, not as upon a door by one asking admittance, but rather, I thought, as an agreed signal, an assurance of someone's presence in an adjoining room. Most of us, I fancy, have had more experience of such communications than we should care to relate. I glanced at Dampier. If possibly there was something of amusement in the look, he did not observe it. He appeared to have forgotten my presence, and was staring at the wall behind me with an expression in his eyes that I am unable to name, although my memory of it is as vivid today as was my sense of it then. The situation was embarrassing. I rose to take my leave. At this he seemed to recover himself. "Please be seated," he said. "It is nothing. No one is there." But the tapping was repeated, and with the same gentle, slow insistence as before. "Pardon me," I said. "It is late. May I call to-morrow?" He smiled, a little mechanically, I thought. "It is very delicate of you," said he, "but quite needless. Really, this is the only room in the tower, and no one is there. At least—" He left the sentence incomplete, rose, and threw up a window, the only opening in the wall from which the sound seemed to come. "See?" Not clearly knowing what else to do, I followed him to the window and looked out. A street lamp some little distance away gave enough light through the murk of the rain that was again falling in torrents to make it entirely plain that no one was there. In truth, there was nothing but the sheer blank wall of the tower. Dampier closed the window, and signing me to my seat, resumed his own. The incident was not in itself particularly mysterious. Any one of a dozen explanations was possible, though none had occurred to me. Yet it impressed me strangely, the more, perhaps, from my friend's efforts to reassure me, which seemed to dignify it with a certain significance and importance. He had proved that no one was there, but in that fact lay all the interest, and he proffered no explanation. His silence was irritating and made me resentful. "My good friend," I said, somewhat ironically, "I fear I am not disposed to question your right to harbour as many spooks as you find agreeable to your taste and consistent with your notions of companionship. That is no business of mine. But being just a plain man of affairs, mostly of this world, I find spooks needless to my peace and comfort. I am going to my hotel, where my fellow guests are still in the flesh." It was not a very civil speech, but he manifested no feeling about it. "Kindly remain," he said. "I am grateful for your presence here. What you have heard to-night I believe myself to have heard twice before. Now, I know it was no illusion. That is much to me, more than you know. Have a fresh cigar and a good stock of patience while I tell you the story." The rain was now falling more steadily, with a low monotonous susurration, interrupted at long intervals by the sudden slashing of the boughs of the trees as the wind rose and failed. The night was well advanced, but both sympathy and curiosity held me a willing listener to my friend's monologue, which I did not interrupt by a single word from beginning to end. 10 years ago," he said, I occupied a ground-floor apartment in one of a row of houses all alike, away at the other end of the town, on what we call Rincon Hill. This had been the best quarter of San Francisco, but had fallen into neglect and decay, partly because of the primitive character of its domestic architecture no longer suited the maturing taste of our wealthy citizens, partly because certain public improvements had made a wreck of it. The row of dwellings, in one of which I lived, stood a little way back from the street, each having a miniature garden, separated from its neighbors by low iron fences, and bisected with mathematical precision by a box-bordered gravel walk from gate to door. One morning, as I was leaving my lodging, I observed a young girl entering the adjoining garden on the left. It was a warm day in June, and she was lightly gowned in white. From her shoulders hung a broad straw hat profusely decorated with flowers and wonderfully beribboned in the fashion of the time. My attention was not long held by the exquisite simplicity of her costume, for no one could look at her face and think of anything earthly. Do not fear, I shall not profane it by description. It was beautiful exceedingly. All that I had ever seen or dreamed of loveliness was in that matchless living picture by the hand of the divine artist. So deeply did it move me that, without a thought of the impropriety of the act, I unconsciously bared my head as a devout Catholic or well-bred Protestant uncovers before an image of the Blessed Virgin. The maiden showed no displeasure. She merely turned her glorious dark eyes upon me with a look that made me catch my breath, and without other recognition of my act passed into the house. For a moment I stood motionless, hat in hand, painfully conscious of my rudeness, yet so dominated by the emotion inspired by that vision of incomparable beauty that my penitence was less poignant than it should have been. Then I went my way, leaving my heart behind. In the natural course of things I should probably have remained away until nightfall, but by the middle of the afternoon I was back in the little garden, affecting an interest in the new foolish flowers that I had never before observed. My hope was vain. She did not appear. To a night of unrest succeeded a day of expectation and disappointment. But on the day after, as I wandered aimlessly about the neighborhood, I met her. Of course I did not repeat my folly of uncovering, nor venture by even so much as too long a look to manifest an interest in her. Yet my heart was beating audibly. I trembled and consciously coloured as she turned her big black eyes upon me with a look of obvious recognition, entirely devoid of boldness or coquetry. I will not weary you with particulars. Many times afterward I met the maiden, yet never either addressed her or sought to fix her attention. Nor did I take any action toward making her acquaintance. Perhaps my forbearance, requiring so supreme an effort of self-denial, will not be entirely clear to you. That I was head over heels in love is true, but who can overcome his habit of thought or reconstruct his character? I was what some foolish persons are pleased to call, and others more foolish are pleased to be called, an aristocrat. And despite her beauty, her charms and graces, the girl was not of my class. I had learned her name, which it is needless to speak, and something of her family. She was an orphan, a dependent niece of the impossible elderly fat woman in whose lodging-house she lived. My income was small, and I lacked the talent for marrying. It is perhaps a gift. An alliance with that family would condemn me to its manner of life, part me from my books and studies, and in a social sense reduce me to the ranks. It is easy to deprecate such considerations as these, as I have not retained myself for the defence. Let judgment be entered against me, but in strict justice all my ancestors for generations should be made co-defendants, and I be permitted to plead in mitigation of punishment the imperious mandate of heredity. To a mésalliance of that kind every globule of my ancestral blood spoke in opposition. In brief, my tastes, habits, instinct, with whatever of reason my love had left me, all fought against it. Moreover, I was an irreclaimable sentimentalist, and found a subtle charm in an impersonal and spiritual relation with which acquaintance might vulgarize and marriage would certainly dispel. No woman, I argued, is what this lovely creature seems. Love is a delicious dream. Why should I bring about my own awakening? The course dictated by all this sense and sentiment was obvious.
Honour, pride, prudence, preservation of my ideals, all commanded me to go away. But for that I was too weak. The utmost that I could do by a mighty effort of will was to cease meeting the girl, and that I did. I even avoided the chance encounters of the garden, leaving my lodging only when I knew that she had gone to her music lessons and returning after nightfall. Yet all the while I was as one in a trance, indulging the most fascinating fancies, and ordering my entire intellectual life in accordance with the dream. Ah, my friend, as one whose actions have a traceable relation to reason, you cannot know the fool's paradise in which I lived. One evening the devil put it into my head to be an unspeakable idiot. By apparent careless and purposeless questioning I learned from my gossipy landlady that the young woman's bedroom adjoined my own, a party wall between. Yielding to a sudden and coarse impulse, I gently rapped on the wall. There was no response, naturally, but I was in no mood to accept a rebuke. A madness was upon me, and I repeated the folly, the offence, but again ineffectually, and I had the decency to desist. An hour later, while absorbed in some of my infernal studies, I heard, or thought I heard, my signal answered. Flinging down my books, I sprang to the wall, and as steadily as my beating heart would permit, gave 3 slow taps upon it. This time the response was distinct, unmistakable. 1, 2, 3, an exact repetition of my signal. That was all I could elicit, but it was enough. Too much. The next evening, and for many evenings afterward, that folly went on, I always having the last word. During the whole period I was deliriously happy, but with the perversity of my nature I persevered in my resolution not to see her. Then, as I should have expected, I got no further answers. She is disgusted, I said to myself, with what she thinks my timidity in making no more definite advances. And I resolved to seek her and make her acquaintance, and what? I did not know, nor do I now know what might have come of it. I know only that I passed days and days trying to meet her, and all in vain. She was invisible as well as inaudible. I haunted the streets where we had met, but she did not come. From my window I watched the garden in front of her house, but she passed neither in nor out. I fell into the deepest dejection, believing that she had gone away, yet took no steps to resolve my doubt by inquiry of my landlady, to whom, indeed, I had taken an unconquerable aversion, from her having once spoken of the girl with less of reverence than I thought befitting. There came a fateful night. Worn out with emotion, irresolution, and despondency, I had retired early and fallen into such a sleep as was still possible to me. In the middle of the night, some malign power bent upon the wrecking of my peace forever, caused me to open my eyes and sit up, wide awake and listening intently for I knew not what. Then I thought I heard a faint tapping on the wall, the mere ghost of the familiar signal. In a few moments it was repeated, 1, 2, 3, no louder than before, but addressing a sense alert and strained to receive it. I was about to reply when the adversary of peace again intervened in my affairs with a rascally suggestion of retaliation. She had long and cruelly ignored me. Now I would ignore her. Incredible fatuity, may God forgive it. All the rest of the night I lay awake, fortifying my obstinacy with shameless justifications, and listening. Late the next morning, as I was leaving the house, I met my landlady entering. "Good morning, Mr. Dampier," she said. "Have you heard the news?" I replied in words that I had heard no news, in manner that I did not care to hear any. The manner escaped her observation. "About the sick young lady next door," she babbled on. "What? You did not know? Why, she has been ill for weeks, and now—" I almost sprang upon her. "And now?" I cried. "Now what?" "She is dead." That is not the whole story. In the middle of the night, as I learned later, the patient, awakening from a long stupor after a week of delirium, had asked—it was her last utterance—that her bed be moved to the opposite side of the room. Those in attendance had thought the request a vagary of her delirium, but had complied. And there the poor passing soul had exerted its failing will to restore a broken connection. a golden thread of sentiment between its innocence and a monstrous baseness owing a blind, brutal allegiance to the law of self. What reparations could I make? Are there masses that can be said for the repose of souls that are abroad such nights as this? Spirits blown about by the viewless winds, coming in the storm and darkness with signs and portents, hints of memory and presages of doom. This is the third visitation. On the first occasion I was too sceptical to do more than verify by natural methods the character of the incident. On the second I responded to the signal after it had been several times repeated, but without result. Tonight's recurrence completes the fatal triad expounded by Peripelius Necromantius. There is no more to tell. When Dampier had finished his story, I could think of nothing relevant that I cared to say, and to question him would have been a hideous impertinence. I rose and bade him good night in a way to convey to him a sense of my sympathy, which he silently acknowledged by a pressure of the hand. That night, alone with his sorrow and remorse, he passed into the unknown. End of Beyond the Wall by Ambrose Bierce. Read for you by Chiquito Crasto, Birmingham, Alabama. The Room of Mirrors by Quiller-Couch. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read for you by Chiquito Crasto. The Room of Mirrors by Quiller-Couch. A late hansom came swinging round the corner into Lennox Gardens, cutting it so fine that the near wheel ground against the curb and jolted the driver in his little seat. The jingle of bells might have warned me, but the horse's hoofs came noiselessly over the half-frozen snow, which lay just deep enough to hide where the pavement ended and the road began. And moreover, I was listening to the violins behind the first-floor windows of the house opposite. They were playing the Wienerblut. As it was, I had time enough, and no more, to skip back and get my toes out of the way. The cabby cursed me. I cursed him back so promptly and effectively that he had to turn in his seat for another shot. The windows of the house opposite let fall their light across his red and astonished face. I laughed, and gave him another volley. My head was hot, though my feet and hands were cold, and I felt equal to cursing down any cabman within the 4-mile radius. That second volley finished him. He turned to his reins again and was borne away defeated, the red eyes of his lamps peering back at me like an angry ferret's. Up in the lighted room shadows of men and women crossed the blinds, and still the Wienerblut went forward. The devil was in that waltz. He had hold of the violins and was weaving the air with scents and visions, visions of Ascot and Henley, green lawns, gay sunshades, midsummer heat, cool rivers flowing, muslins rippled by light breezes, running horses and silken jackets, white tables heaped with roses and set with silver and crystal, jewelled fingers moving in the soft candle light, bare necks bending, diamonds, odours, bubbles in the wine, blue water and white foam beneath the leaning shadow of sails, hot air flickering over stretches of moorland, blue again, Mediterranean blue, long facades, the din of bands and King Carnival parading beneath showers of blossom. And all this noise and warmth and scent and dazzle flung out into the frozen street for a beggar's portion. I had gone under. The door of the house opposite had been free to me once, and not 6 months ago, freer to me perhaps than to any other. Did I long to pass behind it again? I thrust both hands into my pocket for warmth, and my right hand knocked against something hard. Yes, just once. Suddenly the door opened. A man stood on the threshold for a moment, while the butler behind him arranged the collar of his fur overcoat. A high light in the portico flung the shadows of both down the crimson-laid carpet on the entrance steps. Snow had fallen and covered the edges of the carpet, which divided it like a cascade of blood pouring from the hall into the street. And still overhead the Wienerblut went forward. The man paused in the bright portico, his patent leather boots twinkling under the lamp's rays on that comfortable carpet. I waited,
expecting him to whistle for a hansom, but he turned, gave an order to the butler, and stepping briskly down into the street, made off eastwards. The door closed behind him. He was the man I most hated in the world. If I had longed to cross the threshold a while back, it was to seek him, and for no other reason. I started to follow him, my hands still in my pockets. The snow muffled our footfalls completely, for as yet the slight northeast wind had frozen but the thinnest crust of it. He was walking briskly, as men do in such weather, but with no appearance of hurry. At the corner of Sloane Street he halted under a lamp, pulled out his watch, consulted it, and lit a cigarette, then set off again up the street towards Knightsbridge. This halt of his had let me up within 20 paces of him. He never turned his head, but went on presenting me his back, a target not to be missed. Why not do it now? Better now and here than in a crowded thoroughfare. My right hand gripped the revolver more tightly. No, there was plenty of time, and I was curious to know what had brought Gervase out at this hour, why he had left his guests or his wife's guests to take care of themselves, why he chose to be trudging afoot through this infernally unpleasant snow. The roadway in Sloane Street was churned into a brown mass like chocolate, but the last bus had rolled home and left it to freeze in peace. Halfway up the street I saw Gervase meet and pass a policeman, and altered my own pace to a lagging walk. Even so, the fellow eyed me suspiciously as I went by, or so I thought, and guessing that he kept a watch on me, I dropped still further behind my man. But the lamps were bright at the end of the street, and I saw him turn to the right by the great drapery shop at the corner. Once past this corner, I was able to put on a spurt. He crossed the roadway by the Albert Gate, and by the time he reached the park railings, the old distance separated us once more. Halfway up the slope he came to a halt by the stone drinking trough, and, flattening myself against the railings, I saw him try the thin ice in the trough with his fingertips, but in a hesitating way, as if his thoughts ran on something else, and he scarcely knew what he did or why he did it. It must have been half a minute before he recovered himself with a shrug of his shoulders, and plunging both hands deep in his pockets, resumed his pace. As we passed Hyde Park Corner, I glanced up at the clock there. The time was between 1:15 and 10 minutes to 1. At the entrance of Down Street he turned aside again, and began to lead me a zigzag dance to the quiet thoroughfare, and I followed, still to the tune of the Wiener Blut. But now, at the corner of Charles Street, I blundered against another policeman, who flashed his lantern in my face, stared after Gervase, and asked me what my game was. I demanded innocently enough to be shown the nearest way to Oxford Street, and the fellow, after pausing a moment to chew his suspicions, walked with me slowly to the southwest corner of Berkeley Square, and pointed northwards. "That's your road," he growled. "Straight on, and don't you forget it." He stood and watched me on my way, nor did I dare to turn aside until well clear of the square. At the crossing of Davies and Grosvenor Streets, however, I supposed myself safe, and halted for a moment. From the shadow of a porch at my elbow a thin voice accosted me. "Kind gentleman." "Eh?" I spun around on her sharply, for it was a woman, stretching out one skinny hand and gathering her rags together with the other. "Kind gentleman, spare a cuppa. I've no better days, I have indeed." "Well," said I, "as it happens, I'm in the same case, and they couldn't be much worse, could they?" She drew a shuddering breath back through her teeth, but still held out her hand. I felt for my last coin, and her fingers closed on it so sharply that their long nails scraped the back of mine. "Kind gentlemen." "Aye, they are kind, are they not?" She stared at me, and in a nerveless tone let one horrible oath escape her. "There'll be one less before morning," said I, "if that's any consolation to you. Good night." Setting off at a shuffling run, I doubled back along Grosvenor Street and Bond Street to the point where I hoped to pick up the trail again. And just there, at the issue of Bruton Street, two constables stood ready for me. "I thought as much," said the one who set me on my way. "Hi, you! Wait a moment, please." Then to the other, "Best turn his pockets out, Jim." "If you dare to try," I began, with my hand in my pocket. The next moment I found myself sprawling face downward on the sharp crust of snow. "Hello, constables," said a voice. "What's the row?" It was Gervase. He had turned leisurely back from the slope of Conduit Street and came strolling down the road with his hands in his pockets. "This fellow, sir. We have reason to think he was following you." "Quite right," Gervase answered cheerfully. "Of course he was." "Oh, if you knew it, sir?" "Certainly I knew it. In fact, he was following at my invitation." "What for did he tell me a lie, then?" grumbled the constable, chapfallen. I had picked myself up by this time and was wiping my face. "Look here," I put in, "I asked you the way to Oxford Street, that and nothing else." And I went on to summarize my opinion of him. "Oh, it's you can swear a bit," he growled. "I heard you just now." "Yes," Gervase interposed suavely, drawing the glove from his right hand and letting flash a diamond finger ring in the lamplight. "He is a bit of a beast, policeman, and it's not for the pleasure of it that I want his company." A sovereign passed from hand to hand. The other constable had discreetly drawn off a pace or two. "All the same, it's a rum go." "Yes, isn't it?" Gervase assented in his heartiest tone. "Here is my card, in case you're not satisfied." "If you're satisfied, sir." "Quite so. Good night." Gervase thrust both hands into his pockets again and strode off. I followed him with a heart hotter than ever, followed him like a whipped cur, as they say. Yes, that was just it. He who had already robbed me of everything else had now kicked even the pedestal from under me as a figure of tragedy. 5 minutes ago I had been the implacable avenger tracking my unconscious victim across the city. Heaven knows how small an excuse it was for self-respect. But one who has lost character may yet chance to catch a dignity from circumstances. And to tell the truth, for all my desperate earnestness, I had allowed my vanity to take some artistic satisfaction in the sinister chase. It had struck me, shall I say, as an effective ending, nor had I failed to note that the snow lent it a romantic touch. And behold, the unconscious victim knew all about it and had politely interfered with a couple of unromantic bobbies threatening the performance by tumbling the stalking avenger into the gutter. They had knocked my tragedy into harlequinade as easily as you might bash in a hat. And my enemy had refined the cruelty of it by coming to the rescue and ironically restarting the poor play on lines of comedy. I saw too late that I ought to have refused his help, to have assaulted the constable and been hauled to the police station. Not an impressive wind-up, to be sure, but less humiliating than this. Even so, Gervase might have trumped the poor card by allowing with a gracious offer to bail me out. As it was, I had put the whip into his hand and must follow him like a cur. The distance he kept assured me that the similitude had not escaped him. He strode on without deigning a single glance behind, still in cold derision presenting me his broad back and silently challenging me to shoot. And I followed, hating him worse than ever, swearing that the last 5 minutes should not be forgotten, but charged for royally when the reckoning came to be paid. I followed thus up Conduit Street, up Regent Street, and across the Circus. The frost had deepened, and the mud in the roadway crackled under our feet. At the Circus I began to guess, and when Gervase struck off into Great Portland Street, and thence by half a dozen turnings northward by east, I knew to what house he was leading me. At the entrance of the side street in which it stood he halted and motioned me to come close. "I forget," he said with a jerk of his thumb, "if you still have entry. These people are not particular, to be sure." "I have not," I answered, and felt my cheeks burning. He could not see this, nor could I see the lift of his eyebrows as he answered. "Ah, I hadn't heard of it. You'd better step round by the Mews, then. You know the window, the one which opens into the passage leading to Aungier Street. Wait there. It may be 10 minutes before I can open." I nodded. The house was a corner one, between the street and a by-lane tenanted mostly by cabmen, and at the back of it ran the mews where they stabled their horses. Half-way down this mews a narrow alley cut across it at right angles, a passage unfrequented by traffic, known only to the stablemen, and in the daytime used only by their children, who played hopscotch on the flagged pavement, where no one interrupted them. You wondered at its survival. From end to end it must have measured a good 50 yards, in a district where every square foot of ground fetched money, until you learned that the house had belonged in the 20s to a nobleman who left a name for eccentric profligacy, and who, as owner of the land, could afford to indulge his humours. The estate since his death was in no position to afford money for alterations, and the present tenants of the house found the passage convenient enough. My footsteps disturbed no one in the sleeping mews, and doubling back noiselessly through the passage, I took up my station beside the one low window which opened upon it from the blank back premises of the house. Even with the glimmer of snow to help me, I had to grope for the window sill to make sure of my bearings. The minutes crawled by, and the only sound came from a stall where one of the horses had kicked through his thin straw bedding and was shuffling an uneasy hoof upon the cobbles. Then, just as I too had begun to shuffle my frozen feet, I heard a scratching sound, the unbolting of a shutter, and Gervase drew up the sash softly. "Nip inside," he whispered. "No more noise than you can help. I have sent off the night porter. He tells me the bank is still going in front of the house. Half a dozen plaything, perhaps." I hoisted myself over the sill and dropped inside. The wall of this annex, which had no upper floor and invited you to mistake it for a harmless studio, was merely a sheath, so to speak. Within, a corridor divided it from the true wall of the room, and this room had no window or top light, though a handsome one in the roof, a dummy, beguiled the eyes of its neighbours. There was but one room, an apartment of really fine proportions, never used by the tenants of the house, and known but to a few curious ones among its frequenters. The story went that the late owner, Earl C., had reason to believe himself persistently cheated at cards by his best friends, and in particular by a duke of the blood royal, who could hardly be accused to his face. The Earl's sense of honour forbade him to accuse any meaner man while the big culprit went unrebuked. Therefore he continued to lose magnificently while he devised a new room for play, the room in which I now followed Gervase. I had stood in it once before and admired the courtly and costly thoroughness of the Earl's rebuke. I had imagined him conducting his expectant guests to the door, ushering them in with a wave of the hand, and taking his seat tranquilly amid the dead, embarrassed silence, had imagined him facing the royal duke and asking, "Shall we cut?" with a voice of the politest inflection. For the room was a sheet of mirrors. Mirrors panelled the walls, the doors, the very backs of the shutters. The tables had mirrors for tops. The whole ceiling was one vast mirror. From it depended 3 great candelabra of cut glass, set with reflectors here, there, and everywhere. I had heard that even the floor was originally of polished brass. If so, later owners must have ripped up the plates and sold them, for now a few cheap oriental rugs carpeted the unpolished boards. The place was abominably dusty. The striped yellow curtains had lost half their rings and drooped askew from their soiled valances. Across one of the wall panels ran an ugly scar. A smell of rat pervaded the air. The present occupiers had no use for a room so obviously unsuitable to games of chance, as they understood chance, and I doubt if a servant entered it once a month. Gervase had ordered candles and a fire, but the chimney was out of practice, and the smoke wreathed itself slowly about us as we stood surrounded by the ghostly company of our reflected selves. "We shall not be disturbed," said Gervase. "I told the man I was expecting a friend, that our business was private, and that until he called I wished to be alone. I did not explain by what entrance I expected him. The people at the front cannot hear us. Have a cigar." He pushed the open case towards me. Then, as I drew back, "You've no need to be scrupulous," he added, "seeing that they were bought with your money." "If that's so, I will," said I. Having chosen one, struck a match. Glancing round, I saw 100 small flames spurt up, and 100 men hold them to 100 glowing cigar tips. After you with the match. Gervase took it from me with a steady hand. He, too, glanced about him while he puffed. Ugh! He blew a long cloud and shivered with his furred overcoat. What a gang! It takes all sorts to make a world, said I, fatuously, for lacking of anything better. Don't be an infernal idiot, he answered, flicking the dust of one of the gilt chairs and afterwards cleaning a space for his elbow on the looking-glass table. It takes only 2 sorts to make the world we've lived in, and that's you and I. He gazed slowly round the walls. You and I, and a few fellows like us, not to mention the women, who don't count. Well, said I, as far as the world goes, if you must discuss it, I always found it a good enough place. Because you started as an unconsidering fool, and because afterwards, when we came to grips, you were the underdog and I gave you no time. My word, how I have hustled you. I yawned. All right, I can wait. Only if you suppose I came here to listen to your moral reflections. He pulled a cigar from between his teeth and looked at me along it. I know perfectly well why you came here, he said, slowly, and paused. Hadn't we better have it out, with the cards on the table? He drew a small revolver from his pocket and laid it with a light clink on the table before him. I hesitated for a moment, then followed his example, and the silent men around us did the same. A smile curled his thin lips as he observed this multiplied gesture. Yes, he said, as if to himself, that is what it all comes to. And now, said I, since you know my purpose here, perhaps you will tell me yours. That is just what I am trying to explain, only you are so impatient, and it's a trifle complicated. He puffed for a moment in silence. Roughly, it might be enough to say that I saw you standing outside my house a while ago, that I needed a talk with you alone in some private place, that I guessed if you saw me you would follow me with no more invitation, and that, so reasoning, I led you here, where no one is likely to interrupt us. Well, I admitted, all that seems plain sailing. Quite so. But it's at this point the thing grows complicated. He rose, and walking to the fireplace, turned his back on me and spread his palms to the blaze. Well, he asked, after a moment, gazing into the mirror before him, why don't you shoot? I thrust my hands into my trouser pockets and leaned back staring. I dare say sulkily enough at the 2 revolvers within grasp. I've got my code, I muttered. The code of these mirrors. You won't do the thing because it's not the thing to do. Because these fellows— he waved a hand, and the ghosts waved back at him— don't do such things, and you haven't the nerve to sin off your own bat. Come. He strolled back to his seat and leaned towards me across the table. It's not much of a boast of, but at this 11th hour we must snatch what poor credit we can. You are, I suppose, a more decent fellow for not having fired, and I— By the way, did you feel the temptation? I nodded. You may put your money on that. I never see you without wanting to kill you. What's more, I'm going to do it. And I, he said, knew the temptation and risked it. No, let's be honest about it. There was no risk, because, my good sir, I know you to a hair. There was, I growled. Pardon me, there was none. I came here having a word to say to you, and these mirrors have taught me how to say it. Take a look at them. The world we are leaving, that's it, and a cursed second-hand, second-class one at that. He paced slowly round on it, slewing his body in the chair. I say a second-class one, he resumed, because, my dear Cherry, when all's said and done, we are second-class, the pair of us, and pretty bad second-class. I met you first at Harrow. Our fathers had money. They wished us to be gentlemen without well understanding what it meant. And with unlimited pocket money and his wits about him, any boy can make himself a power in a big school. That is what we did. Towards the end we even set the fashion for a certain set, and a right bad fashion it was. But in truth, We have no business there. On every point of breeding we were outsiders. I suspect it was a glimmering consciousness of this that made us hate each other from the first. We understood one another too well. Oh, there's no mistaking it. Whatever we've missed in life, you and I have hated." He paused, eyeing me queerly. I kept my hands in my pockets. "Go on," I said. "From Harrow we went to college. The same business over again. We drifted, of course, into the same set, for already we had become necessary to each other. We set the pace of that set, were its apparent leaders. But in truth we were alone, you and I, as utterly alone as two shipwrecked men on a raft. The others were shadows to us. We followed their code because we had to be gentlemen, but we did not understand it in the least. For, after all, the roots of that code lay in the breeding and tradition of honour, with which we had no concern. To each other you and I were intelligible and real, but as concerned that code and the men who followed it by right of birth and nature, we were looking-glass men, imitating. "We set the pace," I said. "You allowed that." "To be sure we did. We even modified the code a bit, to its hurt, though as conscious outsiders we would dare very little. For instance, the talk of our associates about women, and no doubt their thoughts too, grew sensibly baser. The sanctity of gambling debts, on the other hand, we did nothing to impair, because we had money. I recall your virtuous indignation at the amount of paper floated by poor W. towards the end of the great baccarat term. Poor devil! He paid up, or his father did, and took his name off the books. He's in Ceylon now, I believe. At length you have earned a partial right to sympathize, or would have if you only had paid up." "Take care, Gervase." "My good sir, don't miss my point. Wasn't I just as indignant with W.? If I'd been warned of Newmarket Heath, if I'd been shown the door of the hell we're sitting in, shouldn't I feel just as you are feeling? Try to understand." "You forget Elaine, I think." "No, I do not forget Elaine. We left college. I to add money to money in my father's office, you to display your accomplishments in spending what your father had earned. That was the extent of the difference. To both of us, money and the indulgence it buys meant everything in life. All I can boast of is the longer sight. The office hours were a nuisance, I admit, but I was clever enough to keep my hold on the old set. And then, after office hours, I met you constantly, and studied and hated you. Studied you because I hated you. Elaine came between us. You fell in love with her. That I too should fall in love with her was no coincidence, but the severest of logic. Given such a woman and two such men, no other course of fate is conceivable. She made it necessary for me to put hate into practice. If she had not offered herself, why, then it would have been somebody else. That's all. Good Lord!" He rapped the table, and his voice rose for the first time above its level of exposition. "You don't suppose all my study, all my years of education were to be wasted?" He checked himself, eyed me again, and resumed in his old voice. "You wanted money by this time. I was a solicitor, your old college friend, and you came to me. I knew you would come, as surely as I knew you would not fire that pistol just now. For years I had trained myself to look into your mind and anticipate its working. Didn't I tell you from the first you were the only real creature this world held for me? You were my only book, and I had to learn you, at first without fixed purpose, then deliberately. And when the time came, I put into practice what I knew. Just that and no more. My dear Reggie, you never had a chance." "Elaine?" I muttered again. "Elaine was the girl for you, or for me. Just that again and no more." "By George!" I said, letting out a laugh. "If I thought that—" "What?" "Why, that after ruining me you have missed being happy." He sighed impatiently, and his eyes, though he kept them fastened on mine, seemed to be tiring. "I thought," he said, "I could time your intelligence over any fence. But to-night there's something wrong. Either I'm out of practice, or your brain has been going to the deuce. What, man? You're shying at every bank. Is it drink, eh? Or hunger?" "It might be a little bit of both," I answered. "But stay a moment. Let me get things straight. I stood between you and Elaine. No, give me time. between you and your aims, whatever they were. Very well, you trod over me, or rather you pulled me up by the roots and pitched me into outer darkness to rot. And now it seems that, after all, you are not content. In the devil's name, why? Why? Oh, cannot you see? Take a look at these mirrors again. Our world. I tell you. See, you and I, always you and I. Man, I pitched you into the darkness, as you say, and then I woke and knew the truth, that you were necessary to me. Hey? I can't do without you. It broke from him in a cry. So help me God, Reggie, it is the truth. I stared in his face for half a minute maybe, and broke out laughing. Jeshurun waxed fat and turned sentimental. A nice copybook job you make of it, too. Oh, send my brother back to me. I cannot play alone. Perhaps you'd like me to buy a broom and hire the crossing in Lennox Gardens. Then you'd be able to contemplate me all day long and nourish your fine fat soul with delicate eating. Bah! You make me sick. It's the truth, said he quietly. It may be. To me it looks a sight more like foie gras. Can't do without me, can't you? Well, I can jolly well do without you, and I'm going to. I warn you, he said. I've done you an injury or two in my time, but by George, if I stand up and let you shoot me, well, I hate you badly enough, but I won't let you do it without fair warning. I'll risk it anyway, said I. Very well. He stood up and folded his arms. Shoot, then, and be hanged. I put out my hand to the revolver, hesitated, and withdrew it. That's not the way, I said. I've got my code, as I told you before. Does the code forbid suicide? He asked. That's a different thing. Not at all. The man who commits suicide kills an unarmed man. But the unarmed man happens to be himself. Suppose that in this instance your distinction won't work. Look here, he went on, as I pushed back my chair impatiently. I have one truth more for you. I swear I believe that what we have hated, we two, is not each other, but ourselves and our own likeness. I swear I believe we two have so shared natures in hate that no power can untwist and separate them to render each his own. But I swear also, I believe that if you lift that revolver to kill, you will take aim not at me, but by instinct at a worse enemy, yourself, vital in my heart. You have some pretty theories tonight, I sneered. Perhaps you'll go on to tell me which of us two has been Elaine's husband, feeding daintily in Lennox Gardens, clothed in purple and fine linen, while the other— He interrupted me by picking up the revolver and striding to the fireplace again. So be it, since you will have it so. Kill me, he added with a queer look, and perhaps you may go back to Lennox Gardens and enjoy all these things in my place. I took my station. Both revolvers were levelled now. I took sight along mine at his detested face. It was white, but curiously eager, hopeful even. I lowered my arm, scanning his face still, and still scanning it, set my weapon down on the table. I believe you are mad, said I. But one thing I see, that mad or not, you're in earnest. For some reason you want me to kill you. Therefore that shall wait. For some reason it is torture to you to live and do without me. Well, I'll try you with that. It will do me good to hurt you a bit. I slipped the revolver into my pocket and tapped it. Though I don't understand them, I won't quarrel with your sentiments so long as you suffer from them. When that fails, I'll find another opportunity for this. Good night. I stepped to the door. Reggie! I shut the door on his cry, crossed the corridor, and, climbing out through the window, let myself drop into the lane. As my feet touched the snow, a revolver shot rang out in the room behind me. I caught at the frozen sill to steady myself, and crouching there I listened. Surely the report must have alarmed the house. I waited for the sound of footsteps, waited for 3 minutes, perhaps longer. None came. To be sure, the room stood well apart from the house, but it was incredible that the report should have awakened no one. My own ears still rang with it. Still no footsteps came. The horse in the stable close by was still shuffling his hoof on the cobbles. No other sound. Very stealthily I hoisted myself up on the sill again, listened, dropped inside, and tiptoed my way to the door. The candles were still burning in the room of mirrors, and by the light of them, as I entered, Gervase stepped to meet me. "Ah, it's you," I stammered. "I heard, that is, I thought—" And with that I saw, recognized with a catch of the breath, that the figure I spoke to was not Gervase, but my own reflected image, stepping forward with pale face and ghastly from a mirror. Yet a moment before I could have sworn it was Gervase. Gervase lay stretched on the hearthrug with his hand towards the fire. I caught up a candle and bent over him. His features were not to be recognized. As I straightened myself up with the candle in my hand, for an instant those features, obliterated in the flesh, gazed at me in a ring, 100 times repeated behind 100 candles. And again, at a second glance, I saw that the face was not Gervase's, but my own. I set down the candle and made off, closing the door behind me. The horror of it held me by the hair, but I flung it off and pelted down the lane and through the mews. Once in the street, I breathed again, pulled myself together, and set off at a rapid walk southwards, but not clearly knowing whither. As a matter of fact, I took the line by which I had come, with the single difference that I made straight to Berkeley Square through Bruton Street. I had, I say, no clear purpose in following this line rather than another. I had none for taking Lennox Gardens on the way to my squalid lodgings in Chelsea. I had a purpose, no doubt, but will swear it only grew definite as I came in sight of the lamp still burning beneath Gervase's portico. There was a figure, too, under the lamp, the butler, bending there and rolling up the strip of red carpet. As he pulled its edges from the frozen snow, I came on him suddenly. "Oh, it's you, sir." He stood erect, and with the air of a man infinitely relieved. "Gervase?" The door opened wide, and there stood Elaine in her ball gown, a-glitter with diamonds. "Gervase, dear, where have you been? We've been terribly anxious." She said it, looking straight down on me, who stood in my tattered clothes in the full glare of the lamp. And then I heard the butler catch his breath, and suddenly her voice trailed off in wonder and pitiful disappointment. "It's not Gervase. It's Mr. Travers. I beg your pardon. I thought—" But I passed up the steps and stood before her, and said as she drew back, "There has been an accident. Gervase has shot himself." I turned to the butler. "You had better run to the police station. Stay, take this revolver. It won't count anything as evidence, but I ask you to examine it and make sure all the chambers are loaded." A thud in the hall interrupted me. I ran in and knelt beside Elaine, and as I stooped to lift her, as my hand touched her hair, this was the jealous question on my lips: what has she to do with it? It is I who cannot do without him, who must miss him always. End of The Room of Mirrors by Arthur Quiller-Couch. Read for you by Chiquito Crasto, Birmingham, Alabama.
Hello. So, there we are. Quite a bunch of interesting books. Thanks for joining me today. Supper's probably going to be on any second here, so I'm going to leave you guys at that. I didn't realize I was going to be quite so long. It's almost 2 hours now. Well, it is 2 hours now. So, thank you so much for joining me, and I hope you guys have an absolutely wonderful day. And we will see you next time. Love yous. Bye. Where's the button?